endless. Summon the fates. The three who are one. The one who is three. The Hecate.
Morpheus. It's been a while.
The Sandman Unlocked.
Hello, dreamers, and welcome to another episode of The Sandman Unlocked. I'm one of your co-hosts, Sean Dotson, and it's my pleasure to bring you along with us into our breakdown of The Sandman, Episode 2, Imperfect Hosts. I'm joined by two inimitable co-hosts, Ben Childers.
Hey, y'all.
And Ashley Mowers.
Hello. On each TV deep dive, we will be working our way through 5 sections. First, we will summarize that week's episode and provide our hot takes. Then, we get into our scene-by-scene breakdown. We wrap up by connecting the TV show back to the comics, and then offer our final thoughts. All right, enough stalling. Let's hop into the summary. Sean, over to you.
After being imprisoned for over 100 years, Morpheus, the King of Dreams, has returned to his realm and found it collapsed and emptied in his absence. He finds that without his stolen pouch, helm, and ruby, he lacks the power to rebuild the dreaming, and so he vows to summon the fates and find his tools. To contact them, however, he'll need an offering that he's too weak to provide, so he sets out with Lucien, the royal librarian, to visit the House of Secrets and the House of Mysteries, to recover a bit of his power that he placed in a nightmare long ago. Meanwhile, the rogue nightmare known as the Corinthian is trying to stay in the waking world by staying one step ahead of Dream. He visits Ethel Cripps, now a successful dealer of antiquities, to try and convince her to help him destroy Morpheus. Back in the dreaming, Morpheus and Lucien visit Cain and Able, the first victim and the first murderer, and their gargoyle Gregory. Dream, single-mindedly focused on his duty and responsibility to the dreaming, demands they pay a terrible price to help him rebuild his realm. In the waking world, Ethel refuses to help the Corinthian and banishes him with magic of her own. Dream uses his recovered power to gather an offering to the Fates, who give him vague and troubling answers as to where his tools have gone. He sets off first to find his sand, last seen in London with Joanna Constantine. The Corinthian, meanwhile, refuses to stay in the dreaming and returns once more to the waking world, while Able returns from the dead after his most recent death by fratricide and spends some quality time with the newborn gargoyle Irving, aka Goldie. This episode, Imperfect Hosts, was directed by Jamie Childs and written by Alan Heinberg.
All right, so let's hop right into some hot takes. They were nice and spicy 2 weeks ago. So let's see what y'all have for us. So I'm actually going to start this week. Mine's real short. I loved the image of Dream grabbing the crossroads.
Yes.
And
That was the
I thought it was
thing.
beautiful. Like I just that's something that you can see in a comic, and you're like, they're not going to be able to do that in a television show. It's not going to look good, and it looked phenomenal. I mean, it was beautiful. It was gorgeous. That's my hot take. I'm in and out today. That was it.
That was one of those moments that made me wish we did get like a big screen film adaptation.
goodness.
You know, it was that sudden change of scale would have been so cool to see on a giant, IMAX screen or something like that.
Oh my goodness. Make it happen, please.
Like, I mean, considering the reception that this has gotten so far, just seeing on Twitter and such, it would not shock me if AMC or something was like, we're going to bank on this. We'll do a showing of,
Yeah.
so many episodes.
Or if you lived in LA, you could go to Netflix's studios and watch it there.
That
oh my
is,
God,
as
that'd be
they
amazing.
say, the dream.
Netflix, please. Please. All right, Ashley, what'd you have?
Similar to you, the Hecate were so well done. That whole meeting, the gathering of the items and everything, I was really bracing myself to be admittedly disappointed, but I thought it was beautifully rendered. Also, the inclusion of the hangman's rope with the Japanese cinephile, I remember reading the comic and going, there's no way they're going to include that. It's too esoteric, a little odd for people who aren't familiar, but the fact that they kept it got a lot of cheering from me. So I was really thrilled by all of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I hope we can like dig more into that sequence in particular because it was so impressive. Like the whole that whole gathering of the offering was just amazing.
Yeah. Well, let's get your hot take, and then we'll jump into the breakdown where I'm sure we'll go into it some more.
All right. Well, I thought this might have been a weird take before I started hearing both of you, but maybe it's not so weird. I like this episode maybe more than the first one. I think more than the first one, actually.
All right.
It felt less encumbered by the weight of its own history somehow, and less focused on padding the story to fit an hour runtime. I think this 30 to 40 minute mark works really well for adapting what was only 22 pages in print.
Right.
I think the changes that were made were appropriate here, more so than in the first episode. We also got to see a lot of really cool character moments for Dream in particular. Like, he is clearly the protagonist of this episode. And I think they did a wonderful job of showing us who he is and what he's about, both good and bad. And even though there weren't necessarily shots other than that Crossroads one that popped quite as much as those comic book inspired images from the first episode, overall, I thought there were some really striking, gorgeous visuals that honestly, like I said, made me wish this could have been a film on the big screen.
All right. So it sounds like we're all quite impressed, and I think we're looking forward to taking a look at each of these scenes and really talking about them some more. So why don't we take a look at our first scene? Dream observes his crumbling domain and attempts to rebuild his inner sanctum. He fails in doing that. We are reintroduced to a much older Ethel, but she looks much younger than her 100-plus year age would seem to be. We see her speak at least 3 different languages, as she appears to be some type of broker of rare objects and antiquities. The Corinthian arrives and warns that Dream will seek her out as she took his tools. Sean, this little introductory bit to kind of set things up, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the thing that stood out to me the most in the opening sequence was just the beauty of the crumbling ruins of that throne room. I absolutely loved how it was set up. The collapsed vaulted arch that gave way to a starlit sky with the remains of the stained glass in the background behind Dream's throne. And then behind the stained glass, it was backlit. So it was like a sunny day was shining in through the stained glass. And yet, you know, you're seeing outside of that just this dark, starlit night. And I just thought it was a really wonderful visual interpretation of, you know, some of those moments that I don't even know that we saw anything like that in the comic, although we'll focus on the show. It was really impressive, and it made for a great set piece, and makes me really hopeful to see what they'll do throughout the rest of the series.
And I think we need to keep seeing we had just seen the Sandman be successful in escaping, and so we need him brought back down. So to see him fail reminds us that while he is back, he obviously doesn't have his powers and he can't rebuild his home, which when he went to start, I actually thought they were going to have him rebuilding it like right then, just to kind of start sowing some of that. So so I thought that was really interesting, just to, again, like telling a story in a new medium, and the hero needs to fail a little bit more.
Absolutely. And I want to call out the line of dialogue where he says, "My tools were taken, I know not where, nor what I am without them." That's a through line that's pretty consistent throughout the Sandman story that I'm familiar with, and I love that it's being set up here, right? Tools are the most subtle of traps sometimes.
Thanks, Sean. I thought that is a really good kind of jumping off point for refocusing our hero, our protagonist, and kind of seeing what's going to happen. So, Ashley, what about you? What is your main takeaway from this first set of scenes?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sean that scene where he's trying to raise his, castle up again was gorgeous, because we didn't really get the sense of how weakened he's been by this process. So to see him collapse under the weight of both powerlessness and grief, I think was a huge moment, both for the actor and for the character. And to have, again, more vulnerability between him and Lucienne is a good setup for the rest of the series. Just jumping to Ethel real briefly, I know I came down hard on her the last TV episode that we did, but I kind of like her being this multilingual exotic arts dealer. I think that's
Absolutely.
a fun way to adapt her character. I'm not sure if I'm completely sold as to however that will develop. You know, I think I'm still a little anxious because I've seen so many sort of pandering choices in the past of taking minor characters that are women and trying to build them into something more that doesn't develop really in a way that's substantial thematically or plot wise. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I find myself sort of like tensing up, hoping that she's something more than what she was. But the thing that really stood out to me when she's on the phone with all these people purchasing things from her, I caught myself wanting to look up every single thing she had in her flat. One of the things that I found when she's talking about the Caravaggio on the phone is that painting itself has a really funny history and a really interesting story.
Real quick, what's the name of the painting?
It's the Nativity with St. Francis and St. Lawrence. So it's also referred to as the Adoration. It's one of the most valuable paintings he'd ever created because it had been stolen.
Ah.
And it was never found again. And so like the mafia was under suspicion of having stolen it. The reason the theft of this painting is notable is because it's a huge painting and they had to take it out of its frame and then roll it up somehow, fold it up something to get it out.
Amazing.
But it was above an altar. It's not like it was inconspicuous, you know? So it was just this huge deal that it was stolen. So the fact that she has it, that's funny in itself. There's like a joke, there's an art joke there that people might miss if they don't know the history of that specific painting. So it was a very amusing moment to sit there and go, wait, that looks familiar. Why does that look familiar? And then finally tracking it down and going, oh, that's a hilarious highbrow joke. I'm glad I Googled.
That's great. I'm really glad I know that now. And I agree that, you know, this gave us a better sense of who Ethel is. Maybe in that first episode, they just kind of wanted to get her in this position, because I feel like we have now a little more sense of what drives her. She found herself in this position where she was beholden to the whims of Roderick Burgess. And now she's sort of vowed that she's not going to be reliant on anyone, right? She's going to do for herself. She's going to provide for herself. And that makes sense as a position for a character to be in, much more so than that first episode.
Right, agreed. I just wish that intro to her character had given us a little bit more. And so I think that's why I'm so nervous now that I like her, because I don't want to like her too much and then lose her again.
Oh, sure.
Or even worse, lose her to just really poor character development.
I mean, I think the thing that we have going for us is that, you know, even in the early 90s when Neil Gaiman was writing this, he was already leaps and bounds beyond where anybody else was in terms of fully developed characters. And so let's hope that continues on in the television show. All right, so I think the two of you have kind of covered the two kind of main pieces that we have here as far as this first scene goes. So why don't we roll over into scene number 2? Dream must call upon the one that is three, the three that is one, the Hecate, the Fates. But he needs some of his power back to do this. He visits the brothers Cain and Able and their gargoyle Gregory. Dream asks Gregory to sacrifice himself to help restore his powers. Gregory decides to do that. And Dream has a little bit of himself back so he can encounter the Fates. All right, Ashley. Shorter scene, very impactful, at least for me. I cried a little bit. How did you do here?
Yeah, I would say just taking it as a television show, not bringing any sort of foreknowledge into it. Well done scene. Characters are introduced really well. You kind of get their motivations pretty quickly. Gregory is adorable.
Yeah, he is.
I want one so bad.
Oh my goodness.
And so the idea of Dream having so much respect for his creation to ask it permission before he absorbs it back into it himself.
Right.
was really beautiful and very heartbreaking. I thought the animation of Gregory and the animation of him sort of turning back into this sand was just whimsical in the best way. That didn't make it trite. I think it's easy sometimes with some of these fantasy elements to kind of be like, look, magic. But instead, it was this really beautifully heartbreaking scene. And both my husband and I were tearing up watching it. And especially for Cain and Abel's reactions for it,
Yes.
And again, comic book knowledge aside, we've already seen them interact with one another. So to see the harsher brother, Cain, also have a really strong emotional reaction to this loss is huge and just very moving.
Can I ask what size of a Gregory plushie would be your ideal size?
1-to-1.
I mean, it should take up an entire corner of a
1-to-1.
room. Like
Okay.
I should be able to, like those plushy Snorlaxes you could get at the
Sure.
fair and such,
Absolutely.
those huge ones.
Yeah.
I want one I can sit back into, like a gaming chair.
Ah, got it. Okay, he can kind of wrap you up and make you feel safe.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
Who needs a weighted blanket when you've got a Gregory?
I would also like him to be filled with sand in case I need to reenact the scene.
Yes.
Sort of tear a little bit open.
You could
pour some
put
out.
a vacuum cleaner down your arm
Yeah,
and
yeah.
just kind of turn it on and absorb him back in. All right, Sean, what about you? What did you pull away from this scene?
One of the things I really valued about this episode was what it told us about Morpheus, who's called Morpheus for the first time in the show in this scene by Cain, I believe. I think what stood out to me here, and I think the whole thing worked really well. I loved Gregory's role in the story. He's adorable, and you like him, and it really isn't fair that Morpheus absorbs him to power his search for his tools. It's kind of unjust and heartless, but that's part of Morpheus.
Right.
He will do what needs to be done, even if it hurts people, even if it hurts him,
Yeah.
and maybe especially if it hurts him.
Absolutely.
So we see this other side of him for the first time, and it's great to look into the contrasts of Dream's character, because he's going to do what is necessary to fulfill his function, and yet Tom Sturridge is able to communicate just how much that costs him, right? He looks utterly heartbroken at having to do this. You have served this kingdom with great honor, right? It's as close as Morpheus can come to being I love you, man. But he did just walk off without a word after that. That was pretty cold.
I think it shows his, like you said, he is very focused on a goal.
Yes.
Right? And he knows that, I think for him, kind of you're trying to put yourself in, something that's larger than a deity, right? That is an aspect of creation. And just what is going through his mind as he has stand there. He took the time to talk to his subjects, talk to the people that are in the realm, ask Gregory for this. And he's like, I gotta go. This already took, I could have just probably done it from where I was. Just could have snapped his finger and been all right, power's back and I'm going. So I think, he's trying to hightail it out of there.
Yeah, the fact that he makes a personal visit, makes a personal request, I think he's a lord familiar enough with his subjects to know that nothing he says in this moment will console Cain and Abel.
I think
he knows Abel to be admittedly a little bit of a suck up, and so he's like, Abel will get over it. I know him. He'll be fine ultimately, and I know what will cheer him up. Cain is going to be ticked off. He's going to be Cain, and eventually, he'll probably take it out on his brother, and then they'll bounce back because they always do. And also, he's the lord of this realm. Really, like Ben said, he has no time to waste. So I think whenever we see a Morpheus that's a little too human or a little too empathetic, I start to question if we're actually seeing Morpheus or if we're just seeing, what the audience is imprinting on him. So I'm kind of happy that he was a little aloof, because I think that's more true to the character, and also just makes sense with consideration to the ranking in this realm overall. Even Lucien was pretty much like, all right, well, TikTok, let's go. Which I appreciate that dynamic, that you can kind of see this hierarchy of these roles in his realm developing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I agree with that. I watched the episode with my wife Joy, and during that scene, she's like, why doesn't he just explain what happened? Like, he's been imprisoned all this time, he needs to do this stuff. Why doesn't he explain that to them? And I'm like, well, this is the most prideful dude in the universe. Like, he would never, at least at this point of the story, lower himself to apologize or explain, really.
Right. And it doesn't matter, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like, it doesn't matter. So,
Yeah. Well, and Cain and Able aren't really particularly rational creatures. Like they act like it sometimes with their own quibbles with one another. But as far as anything else is concerned, they're so myopic with their own problems that they're not really gonna. I don't think they're gonna fully process the scope of this situation, even if you were to take the time to explain it.
But I did love that they pushed back some on that.
Yeah.
You know.
definitely. Yeah, that showed character, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
certainly. What did you all think of the end of that scene where Cain just kind of goes at Abel with the pitchfork?
That's going to be one of those things where I'm almost more interested in, like, what did Joy think of that? Because, like, I knew it was going to happen.
Yeah.
Like, I read the comics. I'm sure Ashley knew it was going to happen. Like, I want to know what people who have no idea. Like, that was kind of like what I was thinking about it, because I was waiting for it. Like, I was like, oh, he's gonna die. I know he's gonna die. He's gonna kill him. Was he gonna kill him?
Well, in this case, that wouldn't work. 'Cause I gave Joy Sandman after like one of our first dates, so she's a long time.
Got it.
fan,
Okay.
too.
Alan has never read. So my husband has never read Sandman at all.
Here we go.
So even in that moment, he was just like, "Oh, yep, okay, that makes sense. I get what's going on here. Okay, that's funny." So for him, it was kind of comedic and sort of like that's fitting and a nice. Well, not a nice. That's an odd word to use for this situation. It was a decent way to break up the tension and the remorse
Right.
of what just happened moments ago. As having read the comics again, I would have been very confused and disappointed if there had not been a little bit of murder
Oh
Absolutely.
yeah, certainly.
pretty early on.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, great. Well, thanks both for taking a look at that scene, and let's dive right into our third one and kind of the midway point, the big moment here. The Corinthian continues to press Ethel on the whereabouts of Dream's tools. Dream navigates the dreaming, looking for the crossroads, the gallows, and a serpent as offerings for the fates. Morpheus, Lord of Dreams, summons the fates and asks 3 questions about the whereabouts of his tools. He gets answers that he is not quite able to use. So this was one of the ones that we all jumped on in our hot takes as a piece that we really, really liked. From everything from how they shot the one that are 3 to the visualization of collecting the crossroads, the gallows, and the serpent. So let's dive into it even further. Ashley, let's throw it over to you. What did you want to pull out of this scene?
I just really loved the performances from Suad Ferris, Nina Wadia, and Danita Gohil. Their ability to both be individuals as the Hecate, as well as somehow manage to mirror one another in their behaviors, in their tone. They almost looked like they were the same person just over a period of time. And the fact that they were able to do that in their posture, in their speaking voice, even the way that they looked at Morpheus was really impressive. This was probably one of those scenes that I was the most anxious about as far as an adaptation. And that acting combined with the editing, the quick editing, with their responses, this back and forth that they had, resulting in that final sort of "you have asked your questions" shout.
Yeah, that was
where it
pretty.
kind of
Yeah, that was
reverberates.
amazing.
Yes.
That was amazing.
And there was the sort of mirroring effect that they did, where you see all of them, and then you see one of them, and then you see 3 faces pointing in opposite directions. Was just totally astounding. I mean, the practical effects, their editing effects that you use all the time, but the way they used them was so skillfully done that I no longer felt like I was watching something for critique, but I was just fully wrapped up in the story. So I was no longer comparing anything to any other thing. It was just me enjoying a story. So the fact that they lost me in the story, I think, is a really good sign.
it's refreshing to see that a studio put a bunch of money behind something, brought in the original creator as an executive producer and said, hey, let's make this work, and then is making it work. I think you see lots of times where a studio will just be like, oh, we have this property, let's throw a lot of money at it. And because it's a certain piece of IP, people will just like show up. And it's true, like people will show up, right? But the question is like, how are they experiencing it once they show up? And now, admittedly, on Twitter, I follow pretty much only people that are involved with the Sandman and love the Sandman. So my Twitter engagement is all just like, oh, everybody must love it. But the people that I talk to on kind of some of the other Twitter handles that I manage, people are talking about it in a really positive way. Like, I'm not seeing all this negativity. I'm not seeing a lot of people that are like, what was this? And it seems a really refreshing thing that, you can spend good money and you can get a really great product out of it. So yeah, so thanks for bringing that forward there, Ashley. Sean, it looks like you wanted to jump in on that.
Sure. Well, I want to go, a bit slowly through this whole segment because it was so amazing. In particular, Lucien and Morpheus standing on the shores of dreaming, that long winding pier in that sort of inky blackness. That was very Sam Keith, and I loved it a lot.
Shout out to Sam Keith. Come be on our podcast.
Sorry, buddy. I don't know him. It's fine. I really loved his entrance into it, staring down into that murky blackness, letting the sand drift off, and then that image of him, that reflection, that was very comic booky. That was like shiny eyes, black hair, pale skin, reaching up and pulling him in. I thought it was such a great visual representation of his struggle to reclaim his place.
Right.
Another note from my wife, she pointed out that, Dream says all of this, everything here in the dreaming is a part of him, but he realizes that it's also still a threat to him. And that's another one of those really cool human moments that the Sandman stages in these fantastic ways, where we all have that part of ourselves that works against us, right? That would destroy us, even though it is us, this sort of self-destructive capacity that Dream especially has, as we'll likely continue to learn.
It's probably one of the things that makes him most human. It's one of the defining characteristics of humanity is our ability to do that to ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. So I loved him being pulled down into that, which leads, of course, to that massive hand, grabbing up the crossroads. Loved the scene of capturing the serpent. Loved that it was actually Dream on the gallows, right? And falling through that. Just the flow of that whole sequence worked incredibly well. And, of course, we've covered the Fates segment, the Hecate segment. That also worked. We haven't really spoken too much about the Corinthian and Ethel part of that. I liked their interplay a lot. I liked their exchanges with each other and their dialogue. I think the Corinthian might have a drinking problem. I think there's been maybe like one scene throughout the show so far where he hasn't had a drink in hand.
Do you think it does anything for him? My assumption is it doesn't do anything for him. It's a way that he is trying to fit into society.
It's just a way to distract from the everything else happening in that general area. He's trying to blend in as much as possible.
It's also nice to have a little actor business going on, right?
Certainly.
Drink in hand.
So actor business. I'm sorry, is that an official term? Yeah. Actor business?
Yeah, business on the stage is whatever little thing you're doing. Someone might be knitting or pouring a drink or holding a newspaper or something like that. Just some sort of physical action, so you're not just standing there with your hands in your pockets.
Sorry, I've been in theater for many years. I've never once heard it referred to as actor business.
Business? Really? It is
astounding to me. No, like it like in Meisner technique, they're always told like you have to have an action, and that's true. Like you have to have an action to help keep you feeling lively, and also so you're not getting bound to your script or to the lines. So you're not doing like a line reading and just saying them the same way over and over and over again. When you're distracted by an activity and that makes you seem more human, but I've never heard of it as being referred to as active business.
It's called the
before.
business. It's the business.
Yeah, I've always heard it called business. Those particular motions that you're
That's
doing.
fascinating. Okay, well, I'm going to have to now ask every director I've ever worked with, why have we not used this term in the past? It's surprising to me, and it makes me a little bit uncomfortable, that I kind of like the flirting chemistry that Ethel and the Corinthian have.
Absolutely. You're supposed to.
Right, but he's awful. Like, he's so gross. And I don't want to enjoy them bantering together. But that whole exchange, you're supernatural and sexist, you really are a nightmare, had me in stitches.
Yeah, that was...
And then later, when he's pressing her about the tools, and she's like, I don't have them. And he's like, you're lying, Ethel.
Yeah.
That is, anytime Alan tells me something I don't like to hear, I just, you're lying, Alan. The way Boyd Holbrook just delivered that line is so iconic to me now that I can't hear the word lying any other way.
Well, I think one of the reasons that we enjoy it so much is I do think that, I mean, as humans, we do appreciate when someone is genuine. The Corinthian is, if nothing, genuine because he has to be. He is,
can't be
the capital
anything other
T, the Corinthian, right? And so, so he is fully himself, and he understands himself better than any human can because that's his responsibility, is to understand himself. And so that's why you like it. You're drawn into it. You're like, oh, you buy into everything you are saying. There is not anything that comes out of your mouth that you don't 100% agree with and think is the absolute truth. And I think that's what we're like captivated by as an audience.
Yeah. You know what his performance reminds me of? Maybe I shouldn't have even opened my mouth because I can't remember the name of the movie. But it was an old movie from the 40s or 50s, and it starred one of the guys from Citizen Kane, and he was playing like this con man murderer, and his name was Charlie, and his niece's name was Charlie. You know the one I'm talking about at all, Ashley? I wish I could remember the name.
I'm terrible
I'm
at this kind of
struggling to come
stuff.
up with it.
Shadow of a Doubt. That was it.
Wow, this is 100% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah. So the Corinthian reminds me of Joseph Cotton's performance in the Alfred Hitchcock film Shadow of a Doubt, where he's this really confident, charming, kind of low-key, laid-back sociopath. I would be fairly confident in betting that, to some extent, Boyd Holbrook's performance is based on that one.
Uncle Charlie visits his relatives in Santa Rosa. He's a very charming man, but his niece slowly realizes that he is wanted for murder, and he soon recognizes her suspicions. You can watch this on Tuesday on Showtime. It is still in circulation.
Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah. So if you like the Corinthian in this, watch Shadow of a Doubt Tuesday on Showtime. But that's kind of one of the great things that I loved reading Neil Gaiman as a kid when I first started getting into the story, was that it led me so many other places because there are so many allusions. Like, I wouldn't know about that Caravaggio painting. There are so many allusions that you can track down if you have the time and the inclination, that are so rewarding. You know, like I wouldn't have seen the films of Peter Greenaway if it weren't for Neil Gaiman. Check out Peter Greenaway's movies if you get a chance.
Well, and I think with that, we are going to head over to the House of Mysteries for some tea, and we'll be right back. First, we see Abel, apparently come back from the dead. He grabs an egg that Dream had left in front of his grave. Next, we cut back to Ethel and the Corinthian. She explains that she traded the pouch and mask a long time ago, and that her son John took the ruby. The Corinthian threatens Ethel, but she pulls out an amulet and sends him back to the dreaming. The egg hatches, and Abel wants to name the new gargoyle Irving. Cain says gargoyle names must start with a G and kills Abel over this. All right, Sean, so pick this up. What are you feeling about this set of scenes? We got some Cain, we got some Abel, Ethel, the Corinthian, all the great things. Our side characters doing their hustle.
Yeah, so as I said, I've really appreciated the interactions between Ethel and the Corinthian. I thought they had great chemistry. I thought it was properly threatening, and I liked that Ethel had this amulet the whole time, and
Right.
presumably could have done this at any point, but whether it's because she knows the cost of magic in this world, like there's consequences to magic, using magic in this world, which I really appreciate, or because she wanted to see if there was an actual opportunity here.
Yes.
She sort of waited until the last possible moment, and I enjoyed that. I like the heightened role the Corinthian plays overall. He's been elevated to this sort of foil for Morpheus in the sense that he's someone as compelled to fulfill their function as Dream is, but without the sense of responsibility to following the rules. Like, he wants to do his job, to be a nightmare, but his thinking is, well, why stop with dreams? Why not do this everywhere? I think it's a great move to place him here, and it gives us a better understanding of Dream through the contrast.
Why don't we pause there and let Ashley hop in on Ethel and the Corinthian?
Yeah, thanks. The thing that I really loved about this exchange is that we learned two bits of kind of interesting information. One, the Corinthian says that she doesn't have to tell him. He can just basically take her eyeballs out and eat them, and then he'll be able to figure it out on his own based off of that exchange, which kind of surprised me. I was like, oh, that's how that works. And then also the moment that Ethel says, I had the ruby, John took the ruby, and then the ruby took John, was both well delivered and well written to understand in such a short sentence the relationship that she has with her son and also the state that John is in. So the fact that that one very well-crafted line kind of tells us all we need to know about her relationship with her current relationship with John, and her relationship to the ruby, and John's relationship to the ruby was perfect. I wouldn't have changed a thing about that. And the fact that it gave me the scene that felt perfect, that I didn't have any complaints with. I mean, frankly, you've all heard how harsh I can be. The fact that they've given me something that I'm displeased with is saying a lot.
And then, of course, after the Ethel Corinthian, we get the introduction of Goldie, a.k.a. Irving, the gargoyle, the cutie. Now, question: would you all also want a 1-to-1 plushy version of this? Like, are you kind of like snuggling with him? Is he like hanging out on your desk, or like how are you feeling? Like, what's your side situation? So, Ashley, you said you want a 1-to-1 comparison.
Absolutely, but I also want like blood spatter that I can Velcro onto him at various times. I just think it'd be funny.
Yeah, I think I would go for like pewter cast statuette with the blood splatter on it. Like big ol' heavy paperweight kind of
thing. Are you talking about like those ones that were always in the mall when we were growing up that I always wanted, like the crystal dragons and all that kind of stuff?
Exactly,
and never
like
had
that.
enough money for any of those?
Yes.
Yeah, I should.
Yeah,
I should buy one of those. I just like all of a sudden I'm like, oh, like there's a reason I don't have one because I don't want it anymore. But now kind of like, oh, but I wanted one when I was 12 and 13 and 14 and 15. Like,
who didn't? That and a sword.
Of course, yeah.
You needed to get both.
Yeah.
But now that Sean has mentioned the fancy dragon paperweight, it made me think of. Imagine having like a music box that's the egg that is, you crank it and it spins. It just slowly opens up and reveals Goldie playing that music that was in that scene. Adorable.
Netflix, get a hold of us. Yeah.
I like his
we're here. These are free ideas.
We've got merch
ideas.
These
are free ideas.
I love his little pot belly too.
I know.
It's that little belly.
Gosh.
Yeah.
And the sounds he makes, every squeak and little murmur he makes is the most adorable thing you've ever heard. Whoever does that Foley work they're so good at their job.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for indulging me in my plushie knowledge, as I feel like that's very important to know from your fellow co-hosts exactly what size plushie they need of these different objects. So this takes us to our last scene. Ethel visits her son in a psychiatric hospital. We again see Able resurrected, and Irving/Goldie is there. We witness Dream as he leaves for London in pursuit of his pouch and the human Joanna Constantine. Lastly, we see Lucian confront the Corinthian on the shores of the Dreaming. The Corinthian rebuffs her and decides to head back to the waking world. So, Ashley, let's start with you, and let's start with Ethel and John in the psychiatric hospital.
Yes. So this scene I thought was pretty interesting, only because I was braced for the most grotesque version of John that could exist. So then to see David Thewlis on the screen looking totally normal, maybe tired, but otherwise totally normal looking human dude, initially my reaction was disappointment. But then the longer they had an exchange with one another, again, the acting really held out. And I believed that this was a very sort of suspicious, worn, exhausted, mentally exhausted human that was burdened by, this Ruby in whatever way he is yet. Even as Ethel enters, his tone is of suspicion and unease. They're clearly not warm with one another. She clearly cares for him. I think she would do anything for him. I think that's clear. But his reaction to her, I thought, was really interesting. It's not this sort of desperate pleading mother, mother, mother that we see. Again, I don't want to get too much in the comic book, but that I was anticipating, but just this very cold, cautious, sort of calculating relationship that they have that I thought was really curious. I'm interested to see more.
Absolutely interested to see more. Sean?
Yeah, I think they're both good actors, and they played their exchange and the subtle tensions there well. But overall, this scene felt a little out of place to me. It fell a little flat for me.
Not enough acting business for you?
They were both just standing there or sitting there. Well, I guess John had a book, so that was his business. But I think, it felt a little out of place. Maybe it was the set itself, because this psychiatric prison, there seems like an opportunity there to do something cool visually, but it looked very TV show, I gotta say. I didn't think it was a very interesting place for a scene. And you don't want to compare it to the comic book too much, but compare that to the squalid hellhole of Arkham Asylum, right?
Right.
Which honestly probably is closer, at least in the US, maybe it's different in the UK, to what those places actually are like, considering the resources that we devote towards people with severe mental health issues. But I guess his mother is very wealthy, so she could probably get him in a nice place.
Yeah, it seems like they're doing something different with both of these characters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the way I interpreted the setting was just that she's so wealthy and doing so well in her sort of side hustle of art dealing that she would just afford the best of the best. But yeah, exactly.
Sorry, audio medium. I put quotes around art dealing to Ashley.
I was trying to respect her profession.
Sure.
But I think just based off of the way that she's spoken about her son up to this point, it wasn't too hard for me to make the mental leap that, okay, this is probably the best money can afford. They can't give us Arkham. I'm sure there's some sort of copyright thing that they have to navigate around and not be able to really specifically make it Arkham. So I can adapt to this change because we're not going to be here for very long. Yeah, I don't assume.
Yeah, I guess just because we've been so many cool places throughout the rest of this episode, to go there from that felt like a step down.
All right, so moving away from John and Ethel and going to Morpheus leaving the dreaming. Sean, what were your thoughts on that?
Well, I love that setting, right? That's the setting I love. I love the pier. I love the Sam Keith pier. I love the dark sea and the dark sky. I love the sea parting and Morpheus walking into it, right? I thought it was an interesting character moment that Morpheus refuses to bring a raven with him, right? No more ravens. Mm-hmm. Just having seen the trailer, we know there are more ravens, right? But it's an interesting way of memorializing his raven that was murdered in front of him, to just say that's the last one.
Well, you just got to think, I mean, he had that happen, and then, obviously time is different for him, and then, he just had to sacrifice Gregory, right? So this is very, very raw, in terms of like loss is front of mind right now for him.
Yeah, and I thought that was definitely a nice way to show it. Although, I guess it was a little confusing that the reason you want to bring a raven with is because a raven can go back and forth between realms, right? But the Corinthian can go back and forth between realms. Can anyone go back and forth between realms? I don't know what the realm crossing rules are.
Are you sure about? It seems like the Corinthian is in the waking, and he got sent back to the dreaming by like magic, right? And can go back into the waking, but I don't know that he can come back on his own, but maybe he can.
Yeah, I don't know, because he went back to the waking world on his own, right? He was just
right.
Peace out.
Yeah, no, I share Sean's confusion about the rules on realm hopping in this regard, because I remember in the first episode when they said the Corinthians escaped, I was like, how? Like, how does he just bamf out? Because, and again, not to get into the comic book too much, but, Nightmares escape because Dream isn't around, but we're told he's done this before Dream is captured. So I am a little fuzzy on the rules with regard to who can go where and roam about the cabin.
Fair enough. I withdraw my point. And again, we have our last moment here. We have the Corinthian. Speaking of the Corinthian leaving, Ashley, any kind of comments on Lucian and the Corinthian and their face-off of words?
I've really enjoyed that exchange with them, and I've had trouble sort of adapting to Lucian as a character the way she's portrayed in the show, not because of the fact they've gone from a male character to a female character, but I think just with the way that they've had the character comport themselves. I was looking for like a gritty, sort of dirty assistant that was trying to rebuild and till the soil while he was gone, and we got this very prim, standard-looking librarian person. So it's just an adaptation in the character and the sort of the grit that you get with Lucian. So I feel like we finally got that sort of harsh, much more authoritarian type of character that I'd been looking for. So to see her really come back at the Corinthian was helpful for me in endearing myself to her character. I also like that we're getting this sass from the Corinthian, and it's like, no, it's better there. I'm going to go there. He abandoned us. I thought it was an interesting sort of hearkening back to the themes of this episode. Just for me, it felt like the episode was really sort of going back to this tone of loyalty and who's loyal to whom, and what does it look like for creation to rebel against its creator, and what their reasons are for doing that. So to see a nightmare, like you've kind of mentioned already, be exactly who he is or what he is, even to the detriment of the very realm that he's from, and to the very detriment of his own creator, however that might play out for him, is really interesting. So I liked the fact that we had this sidebar exchange between the two of them, however briefly, to get a better sense, again, of how all of these created or subjects within the realm of dreaming interact with one another when Morpheus is not there. I think those are really critical to the plot.
Yeah.
I think it was a well-constructed episode. So as you said, loyalty is at issue here. And when the Corinthian says he has no loyalty to us, as viewers, we detect perhaps some grain of truth in that after seeing Gregory at the beginning of the episode. So that made it sting a bit more, right? Because we have that evidence just 15 minutes earlier. So I thought that was really well done also.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for doing that scene-by-scene breakdown. We're going to go visit the House of Secrets for some afternoon biscuits, and we'll be right back on the other side.
What kind of biscuits do you think Cain has in his house?
I mean, they should be really gross, right?
I would think, just stale at the very least. Yeah. I don't think he offers his guests the best.
All right. So next we're going to take the TV show and see how it interprets the original comic. If you never read the comic, no worries. We'll be sure to explain our references thoroughly. And, of course, you can find our read-along episodes in this very feed. So, Ashley, let's start with you. What do you want to connect between the TV show and its original comic?
There are so many options this episode. It's really hard to pick just one. But I think maybe briefly I'll pick something that we've just referenced it tangentially, but I really want to pick up the fact that Constantine has changed a bit. We only saw very briefly in a vision from the Hecate, but we do not have a John Constantine. We have a Joanna Constantine, who we know comes up much later in the comic book series as a different type of character, as a historical figure. But now we're bringing her, so far as it seems, earlier in the run of the comics or the narrative, but later in history as a very different kind of Constantine. So I'm curious to see how that develops. I have complicated feelings about Jenna Coleman only because that stems from Doctor Who feelings. And so to see her in another property that I love, I'm like, okay, we've been here before. Don't do me dirty. Generally, she's a brilliant actress, so I'm very hopeful. But I liked that sort of very mysterious, gritty, detective, hazy shot that we get of her that felt very Constantine. So I'm open to that. I think the way they introduced her with just that one shot felt very comic book and felt very true to what we will later know of Constantine. It took me a bit when they kept saying Constantine in the show. I was like, it's Constantine, you're wrong, but who am I to correct them?
Obviously, we're not wrong. Yeah, I had the same thing for me as well.
But it's Constantine.
Yeah.
Apparently,
right, we were just wrong.
Has been a long-standing sort of uncertainty to the point where even though like Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman have confirmed it, for a while in 2011 when DC Comics rebooted their entire publishing line and brought John Constantine into the DC superhero universe proper from where he was previously in the Vertigo publishing line, sort of off on his own, aging at a normal rate the same way we would, rather than stuck in that endless sort of cycle of the superhero publishing world. When they brought him in, there were some folks who would refer to him as John Constantine to distinguish this character from the original creation.
That's awesome.
Yes, very, that's really going down that rabbit hole, but maybe
that I will back you out of slowly and pitch back over to you. What's something you want to connect?
Yeah, well, I would just like to build on Ashley's point for a second. I was thinking about Constantine 2, but in a slightly different way, because I was thinking about how Ethel sort of reminds me of the John Constantine character from the comics. Smart, egotistical, sly, and, as I said, aware of the cost of using magic. Like, she knows it, respects it, and, notably, will only use it when backed into a corner. So these are all qualities that I associate with the comic book Constantine. And it makes me wonder what Joanna's character will be like when she's introduced. How is she going to fit in this world when so many of those personality traits have already been sort of expressed?
Right. Morpheus also mentions that he knew a Constantine 300 years ago, so I'm wondering if we'll see any flashbacks to that Constantine as well, so far as they've adapted it for this show.
Right.
I'm curious to see how they'll develop the sort of lore of this sort of role within his world.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that could be an absolutely classic episode if they do adapt his historical encounter with Joanna Constantine from Revolutionary France.
The French
right?
Revolution, yeah. Awesome.
But for my bit, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Cain and Able and Gregory world. I was surprised to find myself like so many of the changes they made. and appreciate them. You know, even from, I've been talking about like settings a lot during this episode, and the settings at the House of Secrets and the House of Mysteries are very different than what we found in the comic book version. In the show, we're seeing exteriors, this like lush and verdant kind of world, like gray and rainy, but still very sort of green
Alive.
and growing. It's like a little hobbit town,
Yeah.
you know? Whereas in the book, we're seeing these sort of dark, candlelit, shadowy, doom-filled interiors. And, you know, it's clear that the show isn't looking to inhabit that 70s DC horror comic vibe that Neil was going for, like in the written work. And it makes sense because we had a lot of that in the previous episode. We had a lot of those types of interiors. So why not do something different? And I also think that the increased importance of Gregory and needing Gregory's sacrifice to absorb some of that power was a really welcome change. It was a great character moment, as we discussed, and it's a really deft and efficient use of storytelling space. It makes a lot more sense than kind of just having him absorb. In the comic, it was Cain and Abel's letters of commission, and that returned some of his power.
Right, and that's like a very odd thing to like
It's so weird.
talk about like in a TV show, whereas having, you know, asking, you know, Gregory to sacrifice himself has a much better flow.
Yeah. And what it told us about the character and, you know, the way it sort of reflected the Corinthians' words later on, what it showed about Dream's dedication to his duty above all else. I mean, that took a dozen issues or more to get to in the comic series. And here we've done it in 2 episodes. So
That's a really good point.
this episode overall came across to me as actually a refinement of the work that was done in the comic, which is more than I would have hoped for at all, you know, by all means. So I thought it was really well done.
I just had a thought as we're talking about Cain and Abel and Gregory. So it's been established in the show he had to take something that he had created and absorb it back into himself to regain some power. But then we see as he's gathering things, the crossroads, the hangman, the snake, that he gets the egg for the next gargoyle for Goldie from that snake pit. So he takes it. We don't see him create Goldie. Do you think that there's any credence to the thought that he wanted to give them a gargoyle that he knew he wouldn't be able to take back?
Oh, interesting.
Ooh. Oh. Yeah. I mean, I noticed that he found the gargoyle egg and it just kind of showed up out of nowhere, but I didn't know where to put that or what to make of it. That would certainly, you know, it might be more thought than they put into it, but I like it.
I feel like
I don't know. If they had the sense to make a Caravaggio joke,
That's
I'll
true.
give them anything.
Yeah, I think I'm starting to give them the benefit of the doubt. This is... Wow. Okay. I wasn't expecting to find myself here, but here I am.
I love it. I love it. That makes me happy. All right. Any last quick things that you wanted to pull in, Ashley? You said you had a bunch. Is there one you really wanted to get out?
Yeah. Well, just a few little observations that noticed that when I was watching this show made me think of the comic. For example, you know, we've talked about when they enter into the ruined castle. There's that lens flare from the stained glass when it's coming through. That the shape of the lens flare it takes looks so much like the glint in his eye in the comics that I was like, that has to be a 1-for-1. The shape is exactly the same.
Oh, wow.
And it's like the way the light's bent and everything just made me think of it. It's like a consummate symbol of Morpheus to me, is that star shape glint that you get in his eye and in the sky and everywhere else. So I just thought that was really well done. I found myself, just bringing it back to Cain and Abel briefly, finding myself missing Abel's stutter, like the really hard stutter that he has. And I was also really surprised that we ever saw Cain get in front or defend another being at all, even though it was Gregory. That surprised me, the fact that he stood in front of Gregory to protect him. I was like, since when has he ever protected anybody?
Yeah, and do you miss the sort of mustache twirling, like Vincent Price, Cain
I
and
do
all.
a little bit, just a little bit. I think they're doing a wonderful job, but I do miss this sort of like vaudevillian sort of exchange back and forth, where you've got this like muttering, stumbling, bumbling oaf, and then this just really Machiavellian, truly evil, abusive character. And we're getting that some, but this sort of softer Cain is surprising to me.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ashley. I also do miss the Vincent Price mustache twirling just a little bit. So, all right, so we're at the last section. Wrap up, final thoughts. I think I'll start and just say that the show continues to impress me. I'm glad that we chose to do a podcast about it. I'm glad that I get to sit there every other week and watch an episode and just really enjoy it. I think they're telling the same story in a new medium, and they are capitalizing on that new medium. They're showing us things that we never could have seen in the comic, and I find that to be really refreshing as someone who doesn't mind reading the same story from 3 or 4 different points of view. I will say the one thing that I had hoped that they had talked about is how could Dream have helped the Hecate with Cersei? That's something I still don't know. There was a reimagining of Cersei's story that came out over sometime during the pandemic. I read it, and it's written from the point of view of Cersei's story. And I'm just trying to like connect that back in and try and figure out like when are we going to find out how he didn't help.
Wait, so what is this story? I don't even know it.
Yeah, so during the Odyssey, they visit an island where Cersei has been banished to. And this reimagining, and essentially it's the story of kind of what happens when, these men show up and, Cersei invites them in and then learns that essentially they're going to take advantage of her. And so she turns them all into pigs except for Odysseus. Yeah. This author rewrote the story from Cersei's point of view. So you get like all of her backstory about, kind of why she's there and why she turned them all into pigs and everything. And
are you talking about the Madeline Miller book?
Boom, you got it.
Okay. I thought you were talking about a comic book that I missed. And I was like, wait, Neil Gaiman wrote a Cersei book?
Oh, no, yeah, the actual novel. So, yeah.
Yes.
So I'm interested to know how Dream could have helped. I've read the story from both sides now, both the Odyssey, I've read Cersei, and I'm like, where does he help here?
Wait,
So,
are the Fates in that anywhere?
I mean, the Fates are in every Greek, tragedy, drama, writing.
Yeah,
but
I mean, I think it's more the fact that she is also a sorceress, so there's this like competing sort of relationship because they're both enchantresses or sorcerers of some sorceresses of some type.
I like that.
As opposed to there being like a specific beef.
That's a thread that's been hanging for 25 years because that was in the issue 2 of the comic book, and
by quote, it was a quote exactly out of it. Yeah,
never mentioned again.
Right, and they decided to put it in the TV show.
Yeah,
which is like you put it there. Like, what does that mean? What's gonna happen? So I'm excited.
Well, DC's gonna go back to Neil Gaiman, hat in hand, at some point, and be like, "You got anything for us?"
Right.
And he's like, "Well,
I have the story of Cersei and the Fates and how she." Yeah. So, all right, Sean, why don't you give us your wrap up?
Okay. Well, great episode. I like that the show was standing on its own. I appreciated all the changes they made, and I thought it was honestly more successful than the first episode. But as a final thought, I'll just note that the show took some time to address a long-standing but very pedantic complaint.
I love this when
about
Sean
the
brings
comics.
this up. I love it. I love it. Give it to us, Sean.
Which is, why do none of the other Endless help Dream when he's imprisoned? Right? This hadn't been addressed in the comics, and it sat there for years, and people would always be like, well, why didn't Death come and help him or something?
Right? Why didn't Frodo ride the eagles to Mount Doom?
Yeah.
Why could the Death Star be blown up by Luke?
Yeah. And so here you get Dream saying like, oh yeah, I am sure they know what happened to me, and none of them just decided to help. You get the sense that like they just aren't that close, and they kind of have their own shit to deal with, which seems very accurate to me, because if there's one constant in Neil Gaiman's depiction of gods and cosmic beings, it's that they tend to be like very much up their own ass. So that's
well, and we did hear from Lucian that she expressed and was kind of cut off that maybe one of the other Endless at some point left. And so maybe they thought Dream left, because it sounds like at some point, one of the Endless seems to have left as Lucien was, and that was in the first episode. And so, maybe his family was just like, I guess he peaced out. Who knows? Mm-hmm. We'll never know.
We might hear more about that.
That'd be great. Mowers, over to you. What do you got?
Well, one, I feel like Sean and I are both like bursting at the seams to talk more about what you just brought up.
Read the comic. Read the comic, everyone.
It's so good.
Yeah.
It's so good.
It's in the comic.
But yeah, I like you guys. I think I've done kind of a 180 from the last episode that we watched. I really enjoyed this one. I liked the character moments we were given. Sean having brought up like the dream waters or the dream sea and everything has made me think more about how they've changed certain setting elements for the better. Because I know that in reading the comic, I was really confused as to how they were going to develop and explain how he can grab certain things from people's dreams. And so to have an actual body of something he could go into was really helpful to navigate that space. So that was really lovely. It's also making me think a lot more about Morpheus' psychology than I really wanted to. So even in seeing that reflection in the waters made me start thinking about Carl Jung's shadow self and this like primitive idea of, humanity of two selves. One's the primitive self, the shadow self. And that's where you have like your most base needs, desires, and sort of like impulses. And so it makes me think about this relationship then he has with these nightmares that he has created and navigating this identity that Morpheus has, not only with the rest of the Endless, but with his own creation and maybe finding an equilibrium there throughout the rest of the series. Not that this is a podcast about psychology. It just occurred to me that that's an interesting element, especially as they humanize him. Because even as he absorbs more power, he gets a more fleshly tone. He's not as stark white as he was, but he even glows a little bit and has like a pinkish hue to his skin. And so to see him kind of develop more human qualities, I'm curious to see how that continues throughout the rest of the show.
Yeah, I think that continuing to watch, again, how they utilize the medium as they go forward to tell the story will be key to understanding really what they're trying to get us to pull out of this. Because the story's there. If you want to go read the story, you could read the story in a day if you really wanted to. And so it's how do you keep this interesting and different, and how do you tell this story in this new medium that utilizes that? And I think that's a really, really wise observation.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Sandman Unlocked.
And remember, never trust the storyteller, only trust the story.
Thanks for tuning in to The Sandman Unlocked, an Odd Conduit Media production. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Sandman Unlocked. Join us on Discord as well. Thanks to our show producer, Patrick Childers, and to Lieutenant Headtrip for our theme and incidental music. If you'd like to support us directly, head over to our Patreon. You can follow Ashley on Twitter at DEEDEE_K and on Instagram and TikTok at Ashley Mowers. Find Sean on Twitter at Lon Dogson and find Headtrip everywhere at LT Headtrip. You can get all of this info and more in the show notes. Make sure to follow and subscribe and review us wherever you listen. Until next time, and remember, never trust the storyteller, only trust the story.